Okay, I think we can start if everybody's ready. We have more than 50 people online now. And thank you everyone for joining us. In case you are not in the right session, let me just repeat the title of our session. This is the Global Shelter Clusters session at the HNPW, Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Week. And we will be talking about towards a greener and climate smart humanitarian response, focusing on humanitarian shelter. So I hope everybody is in the right session. And we will start now. So welcome everyone. My name is Ela Serdaroglu. I'm the co-lead of the Global Shelter Cluster on behalf of IFRC. And on behalf of my co-lead, Brett Moore, and the entire Global Shelter Cluster, I'm very happy to be welcoming you to this session. I know that there's a lot going on this week and there are lots of very, very interesting sessions. So it's our privilege to welcome you at this session, and thank you so much that you chose to be here. Today we're going to have hopefully an interesting conversation and dialogue on how we can green and create a more environmentally responsible working environment for humanitarian shelter and settlements sector. But of course, there are many, many linkages to all the other sectors and the clusters. So we're going to be having a conversation on how we can link, how we can improve our practices and work collectively towards a more environmentally sustainable outcome for our organizations, but also especially for the people that we work to serve. So the reason that we wanted to especially share the improvements or the progress in our sector at this moment is actually our very recent collaboration with ECHO. So I'll be giving you a brief overview on what comes next for our cluster and why we think it's very important. And after that, we will be having a panel discussion. We have a very distinguished moderator and 4 distinguished panelists who will be looking at our work and the possibilities for future work through different angles. So if we can go to the next slide, please. We will start the conversation. Yes, so very recently, actually starting at just the beginning of this month, 1st of April, Global Shelter Cluster has entered into a collaboration with ECHO, supported by the Enhancing Response Capacity envelope of ECHO, to green the shelter response. Together with the impact of shelter on health outcomes, environment and greening came out as the top interest and priority from our sector in our last annual meeting in 2020. I guess it's no surprise considering the crises and the changes in our work environment. And there's really a big momentum within our sector at the moment to look at our practices and go for the more green or environmentally sustainable option. Of course, it's nothing new, but I think we're right now at a very important moment to really change our practices and to fill our gap in capacity, knowledge, and practice. So in order to make a start for this, for these work streams, we have entered into a collaboration with ECHO. And our project has actually 3 components. Next slide, please. We have 3 work streams that will hopefully correspond to the gaps that we have identified, and it will be going from global to local. Just a brief update on key data. So like I said, our project started at just a couple of weeks ago for 24 months. It's about 1 million euros, which about 70% is coming from ECHO, and the rest will be co-funded by the co-leads and our partners. So actually it's a modest start, but we hope that it will have a catalytic effect, and it will really help us and the shelter cluster partners to change their practices. We can go to the next one. Okay, the presentation is a little bit slow, I think, so I'll continue talking, and then you can read afterwards. Oh, there it is. Okay, so obviously the overall objective of our efforts will be to make shelter responses more sustainable at country and global level. And as I mentioned, we're pursuing an approach that fills in the gaps at global level, but also goes all the way at the country level. So the first work stream will focus on greening the response at the global level. So we'll be looking at energy options, specifications, and things like that. But also, most importantly, we'll be looking at how we can link up with other clusters, how we can link up with other networks, because we cannot do this alone, and it's a collective effort. So we will be looking at those synergies. The second activity is looking at filling the gap in expertise and knowledge and evidence. So there's going to be quite a bit of a preparedness and research element to make sure that the decision makers have the right tools to go for the optimum option. And the last one, of course, is to roll out the results of activity 1 and 2 at country level, to contextualize the decisions and to look at what can be done at the country shelter clusters to make sure that we take the right decisions and go for the greener options at country level. So today at our panel, you'll be also hearing from our panelists who will speak to their experience, expertise, and ideas about these elements as well. So while you're listening to them, please also try to think of these work streams, and maybe also you'll get some inspiration, or of course, most importantly, you will have some ideas for collaboration with us going forward. Because as I mentioned before, this is not something that the shelter cluster can do alone. There's going to be a big coordination element in anything that we do in the humanitarian sector to make sure that we're working together. And I think that's why it's also really important that the clusters are involved, because any effort goes way beyond what a single agency can do. Next one, please. So without further ado, if you have any questions about the specific project, of course, you can ask in the chat or in the Q&A. But before we do that, I would like to introduce our moderator and our panel. So our panel will be moderated by Karolina Kalinowska from DG ECHO. And Karolina is the Policy Officer for Environment and Humanitarian Action. She will be speaking a little bit more about herself before the panel starts, and also the priorities of DG ECHO regarding environment and climate action. And our panelists, we will be joined by 4 distinguished panelists this afternoon. And we will start with Brice Degla, who is the coordinator of the shelter cluster in Burkina Faso. He will be speaking about their experiences and their work at the country level. Then we will hear from Aimee Jenks, who is the desk officer for Global Platform for Action on Sustainable Energy in Displacement Situations. You'll be hearing from Karolina more about Aimee's background as well, and her journey bringing her to this point. Then Mandy George, the Environment Advisor for Shelter Cluster, will talk about our work in Vanuatu on how to make the shelter response more environmentally responsible there. And finally, we will be hearing from Bruno Vandemeulebroecke, Deputy Coordinator of Global Logistics Cluster, to hear how we can work together with other clusters, and also what the priorities of logistics cluster are, in their efforts to be more green and environmentally sustainable. So with that, I leave the floor to Karolina. She will be first talking a few minutes about DG ECHO's work and support to humanitarian sector, and then we will be going on to our panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ela. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, to be moderating this session, and to open it actually with giving a bit of context for this project. Miguel, next slide, please, to explain why DG ECHO funded it and why we're so excited about its results, actually. So at the end of last year, DG ECHO adopted an approach to reducing the environmental footprint of humanitarian aid. We recognize that we cannot wait any longer. A lot, of course, has been done over the last years, but we really were missing this policy, this approach to how to approach the issue. So this was shared with our partners last year, and we're moving quickly on implementing it. And here on the slide, you see the 7 key areas that we identified as both providing the greatest potential for reducing the environmental footprint of humanitarian aid, but also areas where either solutions already exist or where we can do quite a lot by supporting innovation and capacity building. So without going through them in too much detail, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the links with shelter response, and of course this project in particular. We will be focusing on clean energy solutions, on choosing materials with a lower carbon footprint, avoiding plastic when possible. This is linked to the EU's wider approach on tackling single-use plastic and generally plastic pollution. Also in terms of robust waste management systems, avoiding deforestation, working more closely with local actors, and greening the organization's logistics and supply chain. So as you've heard, Ela briefly introduced the project, and you'll see it also from the speakers that follow. A lot of these elements actually come together in looking at sustainable shelter responses. So next slide, please, Miguel. So this slide just gives a brief overview when it comes on the screen of how we want to move on our ambition to reduce the environmental footprint. So of course, anything that we're talking about, ECHO being a donor organization, anything that we implement will actually be going through our partners naturally. Of course, we're taking measures to green our own offices and headquarters and fields network. But nevertheless, the greatest impact will be through the cooperation with our partners. So we want to move relatively quickly. As I said, we cannot wait any longer. So we've developed this phased approach, as we call it, going through the higher ambition to eventually the full ambition. And this timeline is just indicative to give us a vision of when we want to achieve what we set out. So, of course, in recognition that we cannot do everything from day one, we wanted to build up capacity step by step. So that's why projects like this one are key to this, where exactly capacity building is at their core. So in supporting the humanitarian sector as a whole. So very, very glad that we were able to support this over the coming 2 years. And then finally, my last slide is just to give a flavor of what's to come just this year alone. So we're almost done with our best practices compendium. Actually, just a few hours ago, there was a session at HNPW giving a bit of a flavor of what will come here. So it's 12 case studies of tried and tested environmentally sustainable humanitarian interventions that can give some inspiration, hopefully, to partners already starting to think about this in their own operations. And then we're also developing online training for our partners. And all of this, is meant to support actually the implementation of basic requirements that we are currently working on. So these are due by the end of this year. This is a deadline we've set for ourselves. And with it, these will be accompanied by an environmental guidance on how to meet these basic requirements. So As you saw in the previous slide, we are now in the higher ambition phase, let's say. So we're only looking at the minimum basic level, and of course these will be revised in the coming years as our collective capacity improves. And then finally, linked. Excuse me, someone isn't muted. If you could kindly mute yourself, that would be great. So finally, linked to the online training, this will be complemented by a virtual classroom training. So going a bit more in depth on these requirements, and that's also due out by the end of the year. So definitely lots to look forward to, and we're really hoping that as this Global Shelter Cluster project and the associated initiatives start being rolled out, that they can also feed into the processes that I just outlined. So before I hand over the floor to our distinguished speakers, I just wanted to encourage you all to type your questions in the chat as the presentations roll out, and ideally indicate which of the panelists your question is for, or if it's actually a question about the Global Shelter project itself. So we will filter the questions and call on you to read your question out as we filter those out. So not only are you encouraged to ask questions, but also to make suggestions for how your work can be linked up with the Global Shelter Cluster project as well, and that we will take duly note of and definitely come back to you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Brice Degla, the coordinator of the Shelter Cluster in Burkina Faso. Brice is a civil engineer with an extensive experience in shelter programming and shelter cluster coordination in conflict-affected countries for the past 16 years. So we're very pleased to have him here with us today. And Brice, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Karolina. Hello, everyone. I will try to quickly pass you through how the Burkina Faso operation is trying to green its response. First of all, I will try to present the context, and then later on, I will see how the shelter response is linked to the environmental impact reduction. And later on, we will see how which challenge we are facing and which solution we can take from what Karolina mentioned earlier in her presentation. So Burkina, next slide, please. Burkina Faso is a country located in West Africa with a low-income country in an environment where with a cocktail of issues, poverty, conflict, climate change, which literally exacerbate the extreme fragility and the extreme vulnerability of the population. We have currently almost 3.5 million people affected by this crisis, out of which we have 1.2 million displaced population. As you can see on the map, we have a lot of clashes in the northern part of the country, where we have those locations are in the hottest parts of the world. So in our shelter response, we are trying to see how we can consider reducing the impact of the environment to reduce the impact. And next slide, please. And we articulate the response, this action around 3 key axes: tree protection, CO2 mitigation, and also material efficiency. In this specific context, we see how we can have a proper market assessment of construction materials and see which materials are provide less impact on the environment. And we also try to revise the typology of the shelter used by most of the shelter partners and link both, to combine both to reduce the deforestation in the country. The northern part of the country is desert, but most of the construction materials are either bought from the southern part of the neighboring country. So we want we try to emphasize in our shelter strategy how we can see, emphasize to our shelter partners to consider this assessment of a market and the revised typology and reduce the use of wooden materials. The second point also is that we try to see for any new site planning or any new location where we have high displacement, we try to see how in our site planning we systematically consider considering planting trees projects or seed provision of seed to IDPs to plant from the beginning of the project. So at the planning stage, we also consider this exercise. Pertaining to CO2 mitigation, we try to see where we are looking for local integration solution because we are at the earlier stage of a crisis, but some of the people definitely decide to go to the urban cities. And we consider how we can use eco-construction approach for transitional shelter solution. So last year, we tried to invite practitioner of construction which use ecologic solution to do a presentation at our shelter cluster meeting. And we luckily have a chance to have one of them having contract with 3 partners this year in 2 different locations of the country for mud construction, but also voûte nubienne and for the emergency shelter solution, we are trying to sensitize the IDPs to start upgrading their shelters with mud clays within the shelter, which are built with plastic sheeting. This is the situation so far. And pertaining to site planning, we have heavy raining season, and we have also heavy windstorm in series of locations. So for any new site planning, we ensure that the consideration of the shelter typology to improve the microclimate within the shelters are strictly considered, but also we try to see how the trees and how the site planning itself is present in a way that we reduce the heat in the sites, in the settlement we are developing. Coming to the challenge and the potential solution we are looking for, as I mentioned earlier, the use of pole, next slide, the use of pole, which are transferred from a range of 100 to 500 kilometers, having a strong impact on the environment. For the NFI, there is a systematic use of charcoal and firewood in most of the locations. So what we are trying to consider for those days is to see how partners can consider at least the use of solar stove and the use of clay stove cooker to reduce. It's the starting point. Last year's one of our partners have a contract with a project with UNDP to train women in the site in Kaya to learn how to construct clay cooking stove. We expect that this pilot project can be scaled up all over the 5 regions concerned by the crisis, so that we can at least start reducing the CO2 impact. The shelter clusters also start a kind of discussion with the other des architects. This is the national order des architects, to revise the existing shelter topology, including the local vernacular architectural, and also considering our 3 axes to reduce the impact of the destruction of the environment. Lack of expertise. We do not have in our cluster team any person with a background of environment to do a proper diagnostic of the context and to propose mitigation measures. So I think this is the project of ECHO will be a real opportunity for country cluster to identify expertise and define environmental profile and train also shelter partners on the methodology to measure the CO2. In most of the emergency situation, we most of the time are trying to respond rapidly, and we do not have time to find a real solution and include environmental solution to our options. So one of the issues we are facing in Burkina is that we have almost 90% of our response on emergency shelter using plastic sheeting and wooden pole. So we need to rethink the way we address this issue and see how we can consider recycling, or how we can also consider another repurposing option to reduce the impact of the environment. So I will stop here for my presentation.
Thank you so much, Brice, for that rich presentation. We will save the questions until all the panelists have intervened. So I would now like to introduce Aimee Jenks, who works as a desk officer at UNITAR and is the deputy coordinator of the Global Platform for Action on Humanitarian Energy, GPA for short. Her responsibilities include leading work within the GPA on knowledge sharing, partnership building, and capacity development. She is an energy engineer with certifications in training facilitation and international development, working for the past 4 years at the intersection of energy access and humanitarian response, with previous experience in the private sector. So Aimee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karolina. Can you hear? Is it working?
Yeah.
Good. Hi, everyone. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be connecting with the shelter cluster. Yeah, as Karolina said, I'm Aimee, working for the GPA team. Essentially, we work a bit like the global cluster support team, but for energy. So really curious to see how we can share our work at the global level on what we're doing to support humanitarian organizations in terms of filling energy gaps, and see how we can support you in practice. So next slide, please. So briefly on what is the GPA as it comes up, it's essentially the global initiative to support the humanitarian sector in mainstreaming sustainable, affordable and reliable energy access for affected communities as well as humanitarian organizations. So it was started in around 2018, really recognizing that most of the humanitarian system runs on diesel in terms of operations and in programs. Most displaced people lack access to cleaner cooking and electricity options, as you all know very well. So our focus areas within the GPA are improving energy access for at the household and community level, as well as enabling the decarbonization of humanitarian infrastructure. And how we do that is kind of building public-private partnerships, enabling more sustainable finance, supporting capacity building, and hopefully as well data collection and analysis. And eventually, hopefully, supporting that policy change to really enable this transition to sustainable solutions on energy for the sector. And the key challenges we face, there's 3 of them on the slide. There's many others, but mainly the energy is kind of a multi-sectoral issue. So it's it doesn't really fall under one mandate, but it falls between the clusters and organizations. So sometimes you have, on the one hand, the food security colleagues working on food distribution, but the shelter colleagues working on meeting, kind of distributing the cook stoves. And this kind of fragmentation or disconnection doesn't really allow for a holistic solution there. In terms of financing, energy is really something that takes a long-term investment, and you're all on kind of short-term funding cycles, so we really need new financing sources. And there's also a need to really use the current financing more efficiently. So instead of procuring diesel generators and buying fuel over time, there's a need to kind of switch to just buying energy or electricity as a service, as we all do. And then in terms of data and expertise, there's kind of a big just lack of this in the sector. So as Brice said in his presentation, he's like not an environmental specialist, so we're here to kind of support and improve the expertise in the sector. And we have about 500 plus practitioners from the humanitarian development and energy sectors. We have quite a wide network to kind of support here. And I think you'll also notice in the key challenges, one of the challenges not mentioned is technology. So the technology is there. We just need to find the way to enable it to be delivered to people and institutions. And next slide, please. So briefly, I think on how improved energy can support a greener response as the slide's coming up. Obviously, cleaner cooking solutions can reduce the potential impact of deforestation, and switching to renewable energy can help reduce CO2 emissions, and better planning around household energy access can reduce e-waste. And I guess there's kind of a whole spectrum of how to think about this. So in terms of emergency response, what we really advocate for is kind of greener procurement practices. So there's a recognition that probably the only way to get solutions to people quickly is to procure and provide them. But we kind of advocate for making sure that there's a good feasibility assessment to understand if the energy products that you're delivering to the people are really meeting their needs, and if they have training or access to support in terms of actually using those products if they break. And as well, there's really an importance around ensuring that the solar lanterns or cook stoves are really quality products, so they don't break over time. And then I think really we kind of get stuck in thinking in this procure and provide way, but what we're really advocating for is over time, and as crises become more protracted, to transition to a more development-oriented approach to energy delivery. So what that looks like is linking up with kind of the private sector and development actors who kind of know how to enable energy access as a whole. And so that's kind of what we look towards more as things become more protracted. And I think, the main point here is that this is a multi-sectoral and really holistic thing that we need to do. So instead of just looking at the household level and seeing how can we provide a lantern or a solar home system or cook stoves for meeting electricity and cooking needs, how can we kind of look at the community, the displaced and the host community as a whole, and how can we link up, for instance, with the education or the WASH sectors, and look at using those institutional energy needs as an anchor to then enable electricity for the wider community. And so that's, I think, it for this slide. We can go to the final one. And just a few best practices to highlight here. So I think many of you probably know, but in Cox's Bazar, so in 2017, after the big kind of influx, there was a feasibility assessment done. There was a huge need for cooking solutions, and because it was such a large amount of people as well, they were looking at how can we get a quick solution, and I think LPG was the solution preferred. And so quickly, UNHCR, FAO, IOM, and WFP came together and said, we need to work together and make this happen so people can have access to these cleaner cooking solutions. And I think a big enabler there was this interagency coordination, as well as a good feasibility and cost-benefit assessment done during the emergency, as well as the multi-year funding that allowed for this to come to life. And then in a more protracted situation, so in Bidi Bidi in Uganda and Kakuma in Kenya, we have partners Mercy Corps and SNV who have worked to basically outline what the energy needs of the community are, and then basically just facilitate private sector entry to the settlements to then sell their products. So they did things like support the companies to demonstrate what their products are are used for and how they can be bought. And they also designed a kind of smart subsidy, so the households could have basically money to then buy the products. And there was a huge uptake in solar for households. So it's a good example, I think, of a private sector kind of approach through using these SMEs to deliver energy services. I think the bottom line there is that we want to see a lot more of this, and we as the GPA team really want and can support, hopefully, these new approaches to energy. And I think something I've heard as well from the shelter colleagues before is that you need kind of examples of what products to look towards when you're making decisions. So I've linked a few product databases, the Clean Cooking Catalog and the off-grid quality solar products there, as well as a dashboard that we've made at the GPA team that shows kind of who's doing what where. So we can go on to the last slide, which is basically a list of resources. So in terms of integrating energy for your programs, we have a few resources there. You can always reach out to us at the GPA Secretariat. We're happy to provide ad hoc kind of technical support to your country operations. And we also have a training on sustainable energy program design. So it's a blended online and kind of virtual workshop training. And the registration is actually now open for the next training, which I can drop the link in the chat to. And then as well, we work very closely with NORCAP, which is they're a provider of energy expertise. So if you do just need an energy expert to support your operation, you can reach out to NORCAP at nrc.no. And then I've also linked the webinar series and different opportunities there if you would like to learn more. And that's all for me. Thank you very, very much, and excited for the dialogue.
Thanks so much, Aimee. So up next is Mandy George, who is an environmental advisor to the Shelter Cluster and other humanitarian partners. You might know her from various different initiatives in this area. She has a humanitarian background and specializes in the nexus of environment in humanitarian action and the greening of response. Mandy has worked with the Shelter Cluster in Vanuatu to develop the environmental country profile for shelter response, being presented here today. And I understand that this Global Shelter Cluster project will develop more of these kinds of environmental country profiles. So over to you, Mandy.
Thank you so much, Karolina, and hi everybody, lovely to be with you here today. If I could have the next slide, please. So I'm going to be speaking about an environmental checklist produced for shelter response in Vanuatu specifically. So the objective of this piece of work was to inform environmentally sustainable shelter programming by making key environmental information, so on considerations, impacts, concerns, but also very importantly, opportunities available and accessible to shelter practitioners as a preparedness measure, and just an emphasis here on the preparedness part. If you could give it a click, please. Just to tell you a little bit about the background to this. The checklist was developed to fill a gap in the knowledge base of the cluster, which was highlighted during past responses. So a few of the responses had flagged that there could have been more information available on environmental issues, kind of more readily available and in a very practical format for shelter practitioners. And so this was developed linked very closely to the cluster's technical guidelines to make sure that it doesn't stand completely alone. It has a very operational focus and is aligned to the program cycle, so it follows the structure of the program cycle and also takes inspiration and links to the sphere standards. It's targeted at both the shelter cluster coordination side and also program implementation side in the way that it's presented. And again, it was produced during preparedness time. So Vanuatu is a sub-regional cluster that is always activated as a preparedness cluster, basically. And so this was a good example of what can be produced in preparedness time in advance of a response. If you could pass to the next slide, please. Thank you. So a little bit about the process of how this checklist was developed. So we kind of started off with the premise of how do we turn a large amount of environmental and shelter-related information into a practical tool. We initially had a profile which was fairly lengthy and probably not very practical when in the midst of a response. And we converted this into a more practical checklist with annexes so that you can just quickly jump to the part that's relevant for you. The checklist was influenced by a couple of other existing tools, including the Shelter Cluster Checklist and also the Nexus Environmental Assessment Tool, the NEAT+, but of course adapted and contextualized for Vanuatu. It was produced in collaboration with a technical working group of the Vanuatu Shelter Cluster focused on environment, which was established in May 2019. This was really important to ensure that we took a participatory approach with local partners and very importantly included local knowledge in the guidance. And this process was supported by the environment community of practice of the shelter cluster at the global level. So it took about 6 months to create a draft version, and it has been sort of piloted and revised during Tropical Cyclone Harold response last year. So it was used by several agencies. I think about in a post-response survey that was carried out, I think about 33% of operating organizations did use it, and we got some useful feedback on that as well. If you could pass to the next slide, please. So just wanted to flag a few of the partners involved in the process. So as part of the technical working group, we had a mixture of course, our cluster partners, IFRC, of course, the Shelter Cluster Vanuatu, the Community of Practice, and various different government departments, as well as other NGOs and shelter cluster partners. So it really was a collaborative process. Next slide, please. So just briefly on how the checklist is structured, as I mentioned, it outlines key actions for both the coordination team and the program management side of things and field staff, and it follows a program cycle approach to make it as practical as possible. It covers both displacement and non-displacement contexts, and for each key action listed in each of the lines you can see here in the screenshots of the checklist, you have links to annexes where you can find much more information. So these annexes cover things like Vanuatu's regulatory requirements, both from a disaster management and environmental perspective, hazard maps, information on ecologically protected areas, information on site selection and planning issues linked to environment, building materials and environmental considerations for those, debris, waste management, etc. So those are just a few examples of the content. We've left the annexes as live Google documents so that users can kind of query the content, they can update it, they can give us feedback as the tool is used, and so that it remains as up to date and relevant as possible. So you can read the annexes as you need to, link to the actions in the checklist, or you can read it as a kind of a whole profile package as well. If you could pass to the next slide, please. So just finally on some next steps. So the plan is to keep the tool as current and up to date as possible by continuing to revise it, using it as much as possible in future responses. One challenge, of course, is Vanuatu is a very diverse country with 83 islands, which means that there are lots of different types of environmental issues facing the different islands. And so it's not really a one-size-fits-all approach. So there could be the potential to tailor the tool to the different provinces and islands in the future. Of course, we want to further sensitize and promote the checklist in country so that the next response we get a higher uptake of use of it, and of course continue to improve it. And as Karolina mentioned, there is the opportunity under the Shelter Cluster ECHO project to develop very similar context-specific tools in other countries. So if you your national shelter cluster, or you know of a country that could benefit from this approach, please do get in touch. We have another one for Bangladesh as well, though it hasn't been turned into a checklist. It's just a profile at the moment, but there will be the opportunity to work on future profiles. I can pop the link to the checklist in the chat after this as well, so that you can take a look at it. And I've just put in a few contact details there if you'd like to know more. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mandy. Lots to build on there. So now our last but not least speaker is Bruno Vandemeulebroecke, who has been the Deputy Global Logistics Cluster Coordinator since 2017. And previously, he's worked for a decade as the Emergency Response Coordinator and Head of Logistics for various international NGOs in humanitarian emergency operations in Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Nepal, and several more. And prior to his humanitarian engagement, Bruno has worked in the private sector in project management and organizational development. And he is a Belgian national and holds a master's in political science and is the proud father of a daughter. So over to you, Bruno. Thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you so much, Karolina, and I apologize for the impossible last name to pronounce. My apologies for that. I'm looking at a long list of very interesting questions in the chat, so I'm going to try to keep it quite short. And I would like to just use a few moments to indicate a little bit of a background of the project that the Logistics Cluster has started to engage upon, and for about 2.5, almost 3 years in its engagement. And maybe I'll try to just touch upon 3 questions: why the logistics cluster or the cluster system, what is the goal of the project, and how would we like to achieve our project. And the first question is very much why would the logistics cluster engage in actions on environmental sustainability? It's very much driven by the partners of the logistics cluster. Just like the shelter cluster, we are also driven by the requirements and the aspirations of our partners. We depends on how you count it. We've got between 534 and over 1,000 partners. It depends on the counting that we do. And a while ago, about 6 months ago, we had a global consultation with these partners, and we were actually asking who within your TORs, within your terms of reference as humanitarian logisticians, is in charge of activities which were related to environmental sustainability. Like, and then we were asking who is in charge of waste management within your organization. Is that part of your TOR? Energy provision, of course, procurement, which is kind of the obvious one within logistics and supply chain. And we noticed that over 70% of the respondents were indicating that it is part of the terms of reference of a humanitarian logistician to also take into consideration waste management, energy provision, the sustainability of transportation, and energy provision as such. There is obviously a little bit of a disparity between the larger organizations and the smaller organizations. Smaller organizations tend to have a more charged terms of reference, a more charged duty package of logisticians, where larger organizations can divide it a little bit more in between functions. So we see a little bit of a disparity on that one. But overall, the large majority was saying, yes, we are engaging in humanitarian and environmental sustainability within our terms of reference. And then a second question that we were asking is, and this is very much just a opinion. We were asking the opinion of the participants to that meeting, which was a global meeting. In how far do you feel that you have access to consolidated, up-to-date, and accurate guidance on how to deal with the environmental sustainability challenges that you are having? And 64% said indicated a very high need or a need for a compiled and accumulated and up-to-date guidance on that. And that is very indicative, and I think, Aimee, you also referred to it now, it's very indicative of how our humanitarian sector sometimes thinks a little bit in silos. And this is what we really like about the project and the cooperation that we have with the shelter cluster on the broader topic of environmental sustainability on this. Logistics is supportive of whatever sector we are talking about. We always say, or we'd like to use that little quote is, we don't matter what's in the box as long as it's a box. We move whatever is in the box as long as it is a box, which makes logistics quite cross-cutting, which makes it come across all the possible sectors. On the other hand, it's not up to logistics or the logistician to actually decide on what should be the technical specifications of item X or Y. This is where we need the expertise, the programmatic expertise. And this is exactly where the two projects that the shelter cluster is doing and the logistics cluster are doing, and I'm sorry to be a logistician again on this, are clicking together as two plates of a clutch and creating that traction together. And it's very much on this engagement that we are working on that and making sure that both from the logistics side as from the shelter expertise side, we are having a similar language with a similar goal on that. Maybe the next slide. So what is the logistics cluster now aspiring of? What have we been aspiring for the last few years? We've brought our community of partners together, and within that community of partners, I don't know, Miguel, for the slide, within that community of partners, we created a let's call it a bit of a coalition of partners trying to be as representative as possible. And you see them on the screen now. So we brought together both the Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent Societies, the Danish Refugee Council, Save the Children, and the World Food Programme to join the forces in the vision which is written there. I'll let you read that for yourself. The big advantage, or why did we bring these partners together? First of all, of course, it needed to be those who were willing to engage. That was the first criterion. The second aspect is, of course, that we try to have it as representative as possible. And if you have a look through this, then of course you're on the one hand looking at a very broad spread geographically, but you're looking also at a very broad spread sectorally, bringing in both the medical side, the shelter side, bringing in the camp coordination and camp management side, bringing in the food security side, and partially also the nutrition side. So we really wanted to have it as broad as possible on that one. And these partners have been willing to embark upon this project together in spearheading it and leading it on behalf of the wider humanitarian community, because the willingness is very broad. And this is one of the points that we really want to bring up for this project as well. The willingness is quite broad among our community of partners to be engaging in environmental sustainability within humanitarian logistics, but not every entity, not every partner, not every organization is having the same freedom of movement or resource availability to invest into the topic. And then, of course, just like the shelter cluster proposal is doing, we're trying to do very much a bottom-up approach into that. So not necessarily the top-down, but really the bottom-up. And I think just adding to that, and then we come a little bit to the how, or maybe I'll wait for that. Maybe go to the next slide. Sorry, Miguel. So, and what are we actually trying to address with the project? I'm going to need the slide, Miguel. I'm sorry. Yeah, thanks a lot, Miguel. What are we trying to address with that project? Again, very much complementary to the project that Ela and Miguel and Brett have been proposing, is first of all gaps in data. We've noticed that most of the partners, of the humanitarian partners, do not have access to concrete data on quantitative and qualitative data on what is the impact of their operations. There is no unified approach in the measuring of our approach to a certain degree. And then we're talking across the logistics and supply chain operations, of course. And there is no unified approach into reporting on it. So step one is know what you measure and be able and willing to communicate on what you have measured so that we basically can create some kind of a baseline. Now, this is not rocket science, because a big part of this is only being used in the private sector, or a part of this is being used in the private sector, but it is a required step to move forward. The second challenge that we see is the gap in capacity, and then it comes back to the point that I was addressing before on the different size of organizations, the different level of strategic dedication of organizations into the environmental sustainability. Very important in that is, of course, is having both the understanding within the community of partners, but also the understanding within the community of partners, including the donor agencies and entities, from a policy or at least a nudging perspective, and saying this is where we would all like to go forward. And much appreciated, Karolina, also for inviting us to this chat on that purpose. And our last challenge is the gap in expertise. A few actors have extended expertise in the topic at hand, but again, it's not necessarily across the board. And we're going to try to address this through this project as well. So maybe going to the next slide, which I think is close to my last slide. Thank you, Miguel. So what are we actually going to try to do? And I think, Aimee, you referred to it, so many thanks for doing that, so I can build on what you said. We're not trying to create green logisticians. That would of course be our challenge, but it's very hard to teach an old dog new tricks. That is the end goal. We need to be honest on that, but we don't necessarily have time to take that avenue. So instead of saying we're going to green or diesel head logisticians, I'm being antagonizing here on purpose. We would really like to see on how we can bring in environmental expertise into the humanitarian logistics community. And the idea is really to bring it in that sense that humanitarian actors can tap into the knowledge of a group of experts which has been engaging with the humanitarian logistics community and finding adapted, appropriate, and relevant solutions to a number of challenges that we have seen. Bringing in good practices and best practices, let's not forget, standards and best practice setting is something which is coming out of the Interagency Standing Committee mandates for the logistics cluster, and this for the clusters in general. And we notice that, especially within the logistics cluster, our partners have a big reliance on the best practice driving that the logistics cluster is doing for the wider humanitarian community. There is a number of information products available on that. I didn't include any links in this presentation, but for instance, we have what we call the log, which is the logistics operations guide. In that, you really find a very basic ABC of best practices in humanitarian logistics. And we are currently, as an example, including information on some of the environmental sustainability practices which we are advising, but it's just advising or which we picked up as best practices among the community of partners. As we move onward in this project, this body of best practices is constantly growing. Another product that we are having, which is also part of the solutions, is the logistics capacity assessment. Let me not bother you or kill you with boredom on what it includes, but basically the data will very soon be including available waste management capacities in respective countries. So we're working with a number of partners on that. We're working very hard with the private sector on that. We've always worked with the private sector as logistics cluster. But also with academic partners on trying to see how we can bring that information as accurate as possible towards. And this would also be an invitation to everybody on this call to step forward or to connect with us if you would see any added value to cooperate on that. Data tells a story. I think that is quite clear. We don't necessarily need to know it. And then the knowledge where it can make a difference is exactly within this logistics capacity assessment. It is very nice to know that theoretically I can do X, Y, and Z. Our partners, the logistics cluster partners, are really trying to be very much hands-on and trying to say how concretely are we going to put this in practice. And this is exactly why we try to be that bridge between policy and operations, and making sure that we have a streamlined, coherent, complementary, and aligned approach towards the wider humanitarian community, towards the topic that we have at hand, while not forgetting that it needs to be implementable. And this, again, as I said, this is on that crossroads between academic, private sector, and humanitarian. What can we take from the private sector solutions? Can we work together with research and development? And how can we implement that in the humanitarian operational context, which is very similar, but not necessarily always identical? And I think that brings it to the end. I try to stick within the time frame and happy to answer any questions. Back to you, Karolina.
Thank you so much, Bruno, for outlining so well how these two projects can collaborate and bring mutual reinforcement. And actually, I look forward to working more on this in ECHO's upcoming logistics policy, which will have to go hand in hand with everything that we're discussing on greening of humanitarian aid in general. So since we're running a little bit on the time, I will not recap in too much detail on what was said, just to thank our panel for their interventions and to invite everyone to keep posting your questions and comments in the chat, and also to raise your hand if you would rather ask your question live. So there was already one question that came in just earlier to Brice. which was asking whether you have considered planting the trees following an agroecological or permacultural principles and local varieties to maximize synergies of plant species and resilience to the dry climate.
Thanks, Karolina, and thanks to the colleague who asked the question. As I mentioned, the traditional shelter partners do not have any environmental expertise, and in Burkina, out of the 17 shelter partners we have, none of them have an environment expert. However, in one of our cluster meetings, we have one partners who mentioned one of the site where they provide trees. What she clearly mentioned is that the selection of the trees depend on how they can last in the desert. And I believe that what you mentioned, and I have no clue of the content of permaculture and other things, are considered for the few sites where we have project going on with planted trees, which raise a concern about the type of partners we have in our shelter cluster coordination structures. We may think about involving progressively involving environmental experts, and also see how we can consider local practices in the way we address the response in our different intervention. Thanks, Karolina. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And I just wanted also to add, like I said in the beginning, that questions don't need to come only for the panel, but can also be relating to the Global Shelter Cluster project itself, so don't be shy. In the meantime, there's a question for Aimee on the energy aspect. So how can we prioritize energy for vulnerable populations at the beginning of the emergency to prevent any unintended consequences after?
Yeah, I think it's tricky in a way, but I think just underlying the point about data and good feasibility assessments, I think that's also what Bruno mentioned. It's really, we need to let the data and analysis speak for itself. So I think linking up with the NORCAP energy expert roster, that's really a way to get experts kind of on the ground quickly, to really be able to look at the energy aspects from the start instead of a few years into the conflict. And as well, having kind of institutional agreements and understanding the local market as well. I think it's quite difficult in some areas where there really is no infrastructure, but in others where there are kind of a thriving energy market, it's about making the link as well to that market and showing that there is an opportunity for service providers to provide their products to people. So I think those are a few options, but it is very tricky. And I think the data and really having proper assessments from the beginning is really critical for better planning from the start.
Thanks a lot, Aimee. And now, relating to the preparedness aspect, I really actually liked that in Vanuatu, the environmental information was produced and disseminated as part of preparedness activities. ECHO also is working a lot on preparedness as well. And really, this is so key that when the disaster hits, the information is already there, making addressing environmental issues much easier. So, question to Mandy on how can preparedness and DRR funding be accessed for environment, actually, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Karolina. And thank you for the question. I think there's definitely an increasing emphasis on preparedness and longer term funding and the need for this in the humanitarian sector. I think the example of the Vanuatu checklist shows the type of support tools that can be produced in preparedness time, and that take some time to prepare in a participatory and locally adapted way, which is of course really critical, so that they're ready to go when needed in an emergency. And I think that donors are increasingly recognizing this and making this kind of funding available. Karolina, just on the ECHO front, I know that the ECHO HIP has a priority on climate and environmental resilience, which can be accessed for preparedness and DRR work. If I understand it, you might want to say a little bit more about that. But I think that's an excellent example of how funding is being more increasingly recognized as important for preparedness and made available.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Mandy, for mentioning that. Just last year, we had an increase in that disaster preparedness envelope, actually, and hoping for the same this year, which shows the interest and the need. So we had an overall amount of 75 million for disaster preparedness across all ECHO operations. So do keep an eye out for the upcoming humanitarian implementation plans on that as well. Thanks. I see there's a question in the chat on whether there are any recommended trainings for humanitarian practitioners who would like to develop their expertise of environmental considerations of humanitarian response. It's not directed to anyone, so maybe everyone in the panel is welcome to answer that. I'm sure we're all aware of different sources, so maybe Mandy, if you want to start with that and then pass the floor. Question on trainings.
Yes, thank you. Was that referring to kind of trainings for shelter specifically, or for kind of environment and humanitarian action more broadly?
I think more broadly, yeah, expertise, generally.
And the type of trainings that are available. Yeah, there are a huge range, actually. I was recently working on putting together a list of available type of training. So you have everything available from the kind of general overview of how to mainstream environment and humanitarian action, some great introductory courses from the UNEP OCHA Joint Environment Unit, for example, also from Group URD, a similar version in French. And then sort of much more detailed trainings are also available. For example, the ICRC has a great MOOC on sustainability, which covers lots of different aspects of sustainability. The WWF and American Red Cross also produced a Green Recovery and Reconstruction Toolkit, which is a really good training course, normally delivered live, but you can also access it online and read all of the training materials yourself at any point, and that kind of follows the main areas of humanitarian work, including shelter. I think it's divided into site planning, construction, materials as well. There are also some great resources available on green building materials that look at the kind of potential negative environmental impacts and opportunities for them. Also produced by WWF. So those are a few initial ones that spring to mind.
Thanks a lot. I don't know if others wish to add something more specific. Aimee, perhaps you've mentioned a few resources already, but go ahead.
Yeah, we're just releasing a training just really focused on energy access. So we'll have the modules ready soon. So that's one, but it really is looking specifically at energy access. So I think Mandy did a good job at outlining the rest. I don't know if Kelly's on the line. He also might have something to add. Maybe not, but yeah, happy to share on the links.
Sorry, I'm online, but it took me a long time to find the microphone. Mandy seemed to have covered it pretty well, but I think we do need to put together a list of all the different trainings across all the different sectors. And there is some at the Joint Environment Unit, but that's something we should put on the list. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, much needed, I think. So a lot out there. So here's a good question to Bruno, and maybe also to other participants too. So Bruno, what would you see as the immediate steps that the two clusters, the shelter and the logs logistics cluster, should take to advance on this issue, and maybe which other clusters should also join in this effort? Thanks.
I think we already took the immediate step, or we started taking it 2 years ago. by just working together on it, because I think it comes also through a number of the comments I see in the chat. I think Marco, you made reference to it, Kelly, you made reference to it, avoiding duplication, and I think it's mostly about that, and this is exactly what we're trying to do with the shelter cluster, also with other clusters, but the shelter cluster is a bit ahead of the curve in comparison to some of the other clusters. I mean, it's, and everybody's following each other very shortly in the timeline on this, and it's not a race, but it's bringing that complementarity and avoiding that duplication. I mean, we have no time to compete on it. We have no time to waste resources. I mean, we need to be honest. The humanitarian requirements, and I'm talking of humanitarian requirements, are increasing year by year. Not necessarily it's possible to meet those requirements with additional resources. We need to work smarter. We need to work better, and exactly there, it's where we're going to have the gains as well. I think it is crucial that we have an immediate engagement, especially through and of course I am representing a cluster. Of course, I'm going to say this. I think it's crucial that we have that representation through the cluster systems, whether it's a shelter cluster, the logistics cluster, food security cluster, any cluster, WASH cluster, because it is at the moment the most inclusive system that there is across the humanitarian community of partners. And let's use the clusters then as well, and being that platform to bring all the good initiatives together. And making sure that these initiatives, again, are not competing. I'm not necessarily, in my opinion, it's not necessarily up to the clusters to say that they can do it better, a project, but they can be a very good platform on bringing projects together and bringing communities together with the additional project. A big role that the clusters have in that, in my opinion, is that of a broker with added value. It's connecting dots, but connecting them with an added value, because it's their job to know what is the background of the different initiatives. It's their job to know who can bring added value from left to right, who's looking for something, and that is where clusters, individually as clusters, but also in between clusters, can cooperate and contribute quite substantially. I hope that answers the question, Karolina.
Yes, thanks a lot for those encouraging words. Exactly. Couldn't agree more that we have no time to compete on this. So back to Brice, actually very, very concretely, how, considering the context that you work in, how should we be including environmental considerations in already resource-constrained responses? This is something actually we're also trying to grapple with in the development of these basic requirements that we're looking at. So very curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Karolina, on this question. I think it is essential for us to understand the question, the context. And as Bruno mentioned, the more we have data, the better we can plan, and the better our programmation can include environmental constraints from the planning stage of our response. In a context like Burkina, where we have few resources, it will be damageable if we fail to include environment consideration when we are planning. I give a concrete example. Last year, when I joined the Burkina operation, we were already in rainy season, and all of the emergency shelters in the most affected area, a huge proportion, almost 30% of the emergency shelters, collapsed just because of bad planning, because of the fact that the use of wooden pole not strong, have not sustained to the strong windstorm. So how are we doing this year? This year, we are using all the past data we have on the windstorm, and we have a connection with the meteorological agency, and we start trying to prepare concretely. The other option we have is to do a kind of awareness toward our partners to minimize the use of plastic sheeting, and also to maximize the approved local solution, which can really mitigate. The idea is not to choose any local solution which will create more damage. So the linkage with the other cluster here is also something we may consider to improve the available resources. For instance, we can find a linkage with the CCCM cluster to train in site and in location affected communities on environmental issues and to create environmental communities. We can also see how we can create a link with logistic, wash, and food security and event protection to use the existing resources at the cluster level and work on how we can improve the logistic platform and how we can improve the waste management system. Those are essential considerations we may take when we are planning, and that will help a lot to not misuse the small resources we have on board. Thank Karolina.
Great. Thanks so much. I actually wanted to give an opportunity for the colleagues behind the Global Shelter Cluster project to also intervene here. So a question to them, to Ela or Brett, whoever, or both. How will the project concretely reduce plastic use in shelter responses? As we know, that's an issue of great importance across the sector. Ela, maybe you want to start?
Yes, sure. You always have to tell us who has to speak, I think. Yeah, so plastic is of course one of the big components of our project, and we're actually looking at the indicators in addition to the CO2 equivalent reductions. We're also looking at reduction in plastic, we want to look at what could be the ways to do it. And
Ela, you just got muted accidentally.
Oh, what is the last thing that you heard?
That you're adding plastic as part of the indicators.
Okay, good. So we're not increasing the plastic, hopefully, but no, I was just saying that we have a number of indicators that try to look at different aspects of greening the response, so not just focusing on CO2 or tons of plastic, but we're trying to be a bit more all around. And of course, we are trying to do that by looking at a number of mostly deployed items, so like the tarpaulins and the tents and toolkits and refugee housing units. And we will be looking at how a complete life cycle analysis of some of these items, and to see how the plastic content could be addressed either by reducing it, or maybe looking at alternatives, or looking at recycling or upcycling end-of-life situations. So there'll be probably different opportunities for each of the items to reduce the plastic impact along the way. We also are working with our colleagues from the partners of the shelter cluster, but also the logistics departments, to reduce the use of single-use plastic in the packaging, especially. The shelter cluster had taken a position on that already 2 years ago by issuing a statement saying that we would like to reduce the packaging plastic where it's not essential to the performance and the functionality of the item. And sometimes what we realize is that our suppliers are putting plastic in there not because we have asked for it, it's because there is no specification around it. So sometimes by just adding a couple of sentences in saying, please don't package a hammer in a plastic bag, because obviously there is no, it's not essential to the performance of a hammer whether there is a scratch on it. It could be different for a kitchen set, of course. you can already address the part of the single-use plastic. So we will be looking at different actions we can take to reduce the plastic, but also we also have to remember that sometimes sending a very, I mean, tarpaulin is one example of it because it's a very big piece of plastic that's very visible, but having a very high quality item being mobilized instead of lower quality items being locally bought and having to be replaced along the life cycle of the operation could be a worse choice. So that's why we're also trying to look at that entire life cycle of the item and to see what the best decision under those circumstances would be. So that's our thinking, of course, and hopefully we'll be able to give concrete update on the progress along the way. If Brett, if I missed anything and you'd like to add something, please feel free.
Thanks, Ela. I mean, you know, you've outlined it very well. When we're thinking of the kind of examples that we would like to address throughout this project, I mean, I'm thinking about some experiences we had last year, even on the UNHCR side, when we were looking at the, you know, modification of existing NFI core relief items, even using the example of the blankets. You know, UNHCR procures 2 million high thermal and 2.5 million medium thermal blankets a year. And then by going through a R&D, like a research and development process with H&M and all their textiles and material manufacturing expertise, we gave them the blanket, asked them to stick to the same performance specifications, but modify the plastic content of the blanket to see what's the maximum amount of recycled content that could be used. And by looking at that, we got up to about, you know, 78% recycled content. And when you look at the volume procured, that means that there was 525 million plastic bottles saved because they recycled plastic bottles instead of using virgin plastic. So there was a huge amount of saving there. And also you look at the raw ingredients that go in, even in terms of water. We saved 15.3 million litres of water, and 133 million litres of water, 525 million plastic bottles from going into landfills. So that's just with one item, that's just with the blankets, and not even changing our procurement pipeline, just looking at the specification and how it can be re-engineered. When you look at that over the sheer volume of millions of tonnes of plastic items that are procured through all the shelter partners, the cluster have a really significant role to play. So that's just one example, and I hope that we'll be able to trial and get success in for a lot more throughout the duration of this project. Thanks, Ela. Back to you, Karolina.
Super, thanks so much, Brett. Actually, I will keep you for a while longer because our time here is coming to an end, and I would like to, well, on my own behalf, thank all of the panelists and all of the participants here, and actually hand the floor over to Brett for some closing remarks and wrap up of this very rich session. So back to you, Brett, actually. Thanks.
Thank you, Karolina. No, firstly, I'll just start with a thanks as well. So thank you to Ela for the introductions, and thank you very much, Karolina, for the moderation, and to each of our panelists, to Brice from Burkina, to Aimee from the GPA, and thanks also very much to Mandy for speaking about Vanuatu, and for Bruno for his contributions from the perspective of the logistics cluster. I'll just give a very brief summary of the overall messages that were conveyed, and really I'll try to draw out a few key conclusions and takeaways that we can all really leave this session with. So, you know, as Ela noted in the beginning, this is a really critical piece of work, and it's bigger than the shelter cluster. It's bigger than all the clusters, but we all have a role to play in this. Many of you may be thinking, okay, what are the specifics of the shelter cluster and the issues it looks at. Of course, we have the responsibility for coordinating all the humanitarian actors that respond in the context or respond with shelter in the context of forced displacement. So we have a huge range of stakeholders, and when we look at the amount of resources that are coordinated through the cluster down to field level, it's more than 1.6 billion, in shelter interventions in the HRP per year. So there's a huge potential for maximising improved environmental approaches within the current scope of work, let alone increasing the scope of work. And when I look at that and I think of our relationship of the humanitarian interventions to development interventions, I mean, some very recent data that came from UNEP in the 2020 report indicates that around 40% of global emissions are linked to construction-related activities. So whether you look just at the humanitarian slice of the pie, or whether you look at it a little bit more in terms of its connection to the entire kind of process of building, there's a huge amount of that which has a very direct linkage to our overall carbon footprint. And of course, shelter and housing is a very, very significant part of that. So I think that we've got a lot of interesting work that is just at the very beginning now of really being mainstreamed. We've got big gaps in understanding what the processes are, what the linkages are, what tools already exist. We've already discussed a bit about that just before, but also what tools and key pieces of guidance still need to be established. And we had some good examples of that also presented in the session. With what you were presenting, Karolina, in terms of ECHO's priorities, I think that they really guide the breadth of the issues that we need to look at. We've got issues around clean energy, promoting low carbon materials, avoiding plastic where we can, looking at the overall logistics and supply chain side of things too, and waste management, not just at the end of the process, but reducing unnecessary waste, unnecessary packaging at the beginning that becomes waste later on. And also, promoting local level approaches, because there's a lot of expertise there that needs to be tapped into, a lot of ownership and a lot of expertise. At the same time, there's a lot of very significant environmental considerations that do happen at the local level. As Brice showed as well, we've got severe environmental degradation, deforestation, disruption to soils, land, agricultural systems, surface water, groundwater. So there's a package of integrated environmental considerations that really need to be looked at the local level whenever we have large displaced populations. I think too that really from Brice's side, Brice's presentation was looking at forced displacement in the conflict context. That is the clusters that UNHCR lead on the conflict side. And the case study he presented is typical of many scenarios we find ourselves in. Arid, desert-like conditions, we find that in many cases displaced populations are forced to the least desirable locations in a country, and with that comes some really acute environmental concerns. So we looked there at the traditions in West Africa of mud brick and how that can be a source of local solutions, but also local participation, income earning potential, gender participation, other kind of successes that we can get on that side as well. In terms of what we saw from Aimee from the GPA side, it really is highlighting these multi-sector issues and also the availability of technical support, which we do have at hand, offered by the GPA to look at the range of inputs needed. Mandy also highlighted, the environmental considerations and how these environmental profiles, we've shared the link, they can be very, very helpful at framing our approaches in a response, but also the preparedness actions required before that. As Mandy showed with the work in Vanuatu and most of the natural disaster clusters that are led by IFRC, we have this situation where it really is in the face of climate change. And we have to look at the environmental impacts that are there. I think we've got someone who's unmuted. If they can mute, please, just for the closing remarks. Thanks.
I need to first hear this.
So I think, we have to really accentuate the importance of preparedness and linking through to key partners which are within the sector but adjacent to the sector where expertise lies outside. There are some very important inputs that happen at the level of the household: energy consumption, waste production, and local environmental impact. So the house, the home, that's a real key entry point for a lot of these situations. And I think really at the end, my last kind of comment here is that localization is a very, very important thing. Bruno highlighted that in his remarks for the logistics cluster. And I think that, cooperation amongst the clusters is very important. And as Bruno said too, the cluster can be seen as a broker to connect to a lot of partners at the local level, across the clusters, to the private sector, and to other kinds of expertise. So from that side, I thank all our panelists. Thanks to Ela. Thank you very much to Karolina for facilitating the session as well. And I look forward to the participation of all of you. We'll send out more information on the ECHO project, ECHO-funded project on greening the response as the next steps are taken. We're right near the beginning now. It's a very exciting phase. But we look forward to participation, and we really want everybody to maintain a focus on these issues and find, some solutions collectively. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Have a very nice day.
Thank you, everyone.
Very much. Bye-bye.